In 1938, an amazing expedition set out to explore a remote, sacred land beyond the Himalayas, Tibet.
The expedition was an extraordinary achievement. Those months they spent in that strange land, opening it up.
The explorers were a team of elite Nazi scientists, led by a glamorous adventurer.
He was the Indiana Jones of the Third Reich.
Dispatched on a mission by the most feared man in Nazi Germany, Heinrich Himmler. His quest was as audacious as it was ambitious. To find evidence that linked German Aryans to the ancient super race of a lost empire.
If only Tibet could yield up, the land of the snows could yield up its secrets.
This is Himmler's quest to find the fabled lost people of Atlantis. In 1936, one of Nazi Germany's rising stars, 26-year-old zoologist Ernst Schaefer, was officially summoned to SS headquarters in Berlin. He had an appointment with the most powerful and feared man in the Third Reich. Not Adolf Hitler, but Heinrich Himmler. As Reichsführer, Himmler commanded an elite SS paramilitary force 250,000 strong, a black-clad army dedicated to the supremacy of the German race. He was chief of all police throughout Germany, including the secret police, the brutal Gestapo. Himmler organized the arrest and detention of Jews as controller of a growing number of concentration camps.
The SS was a huge set of tentacles reach out into Germany, and they're SS tentacles, and Himmler is chief of them.
Now Himmler's tentacles were reaching out to envelop the young scientist Ernst Schaefer. Himmler wanted him to solve a problem. The Nazis claimed that the Germans were the master race, destined to rule. This ideology justified the Germans' domination of Europe and hatred of the Jews. Himmler needed German superiority to be proved a fact. For his proof, he turned to an ancient myth, the lost world of Atlantis. Atlantis was described as a vast continent in the Atlantic Ocean. Its people were elite humans who conquered and dominated all other cultures and races. The empire of Atlantis reached into Europe, Africa, and South America. But for Himmler, Atlantis wasn't a story, but historical fact.
So Atlantis, he came to believe, Himmler, had actually existed. It wasn't a myth, but it was also scientifically based. There had been an Atlantis.
Getting evidence that the descendants of the Atlanteans were none other than the German people wasn't easy. The island of Atlantis disappeared in a day and a night. It was destroyed by earthquakes and volcanoes, consumed by the ocean, and lost beneath the waves forever. Far from the Atlantean civilization being lost in the cataclysm, Himmler believed it lived on. He held that Atlantis gave birth to every great civilization: the Greeks, the Romans, the Mayans and Aztecs of South America, even the ancient Egyptians. That these inferior peoples had been bequeathed their culture by the superior people of Atlantis.
From the very beginning, it's all to do with race. Racism impregnates the Atlantis myth. It's about a superior race of beings who spread this knowledge around the world.
Himmler had a specific mission for Schaefer. He was to lead an SS scientific expedition and bring him proof that German Aryans were the descendants of this superior race, the lost people of Atlantis. Himmler had chosen Schaefer in particular for this task, not only for his scientific credentials, but because he was already a famous explorer. In 1930s Germany, Dr. Ernst Schaefer cut a heroic figure. He'd been a member of 2 American-led expeditions into Tibet. He was a fastidious scientist and passionate hunter who loved to study mammals and birds in the wild, and after he'd shot them. An ambitious self-publicist, he wrote books about his exploits as a young sharp-shooting adventurer. They made him a celebrity in Germany.
He becomes, for Germans, an embodiment of the ideal German in a way. I think that's how Himmler regarded him. A sort of heroic, brave, physically resourceful. The cliché would be Indiana Jones, the Indiana Jones of the Third Reich.
Ernst Schaefer was the ideal person to lead the SS scientific expedition into Tibet. Himmler pledged him his personal support. Himmler told Schaefer that in ancient times, survivors of Atlantis had founded a great civilization in Asia. One mysterious country least diluted by the centuries of history was remote Tibet.
For Heinrich Himmler, Tibet had an extraordinary appeal. The supermen of the Aryan race had gone there and in the fastness of Tibet had re-established their culture and their ways, cut off, remote from the outside world.
In the 1930s, Tibet was one of the few scientifically unresearched areas of the world. Situated in the center of Asia, but isolated by the Himalayan mountains, the Tibetan plateau covers nearly 1 million square miles at an altitude of up to 15,000 feet. Could this natural fortress have sheltered survivors of Atlantis? If they did settle there, then the isolation would have kept them racially pure. They would be distant cousins of the German master race.
If Tibet could be reopened and the evidence of the supermen of the past be rediscovered, here was the best proof possible of the validity of the argument that modern Germany and the Nazi movement and the Aryans of Germany now were directly related to the supermen.
Tibet at this point in time was so unexplored compared to other regions of the world that any expedition to Tibet would be a big coup.
To lead his own expedition into Tibet was a dream come true for the ambitious Schaefer. But there was a sting in the tail. Doing science for the SS meant doing it the SS way. In 1935, Himmler set up the Ahnenerbe, a research organization within the SS. Its job was to prove Nazi ideology.
The idea is to help a number of German scientists dig into the past of the German peoples and in a way to endorse them as the superior people of Europe.
The Ahnenerbe recruited corrupt scientists and scholars prepared to ransack Germany's past and glorify it.
We would say that Ahnenerbe is an attempt to rewrite history. Himmler claimed it was a rediscovery of the true German history. And that's why all aspects of archaeology, philology, semantics, language, you name it, any ology or onomy, it had to be taken into Ahnenerbe because those elements could become means by which the truth of the great German past could be rediscovered.
What is remarkable is that the German state of the time, the Nazi state, certainly according to the SS chief Heinrich Himmler, needed to create its own mythologies.
the ancient swastika symbol was appropriated to represent Nazi power and signify their hatred of what they saw as inferior peoples. The Ahnenerbe also undermined what it saw as anti-German science. Even the great Einstein, because he was Jewish.
German nationalists resented the achievements of Jewish scientists, and they came up with an absurd idea that their science was in some way Jewish and therefore not wanted in Germany. And this did force them to validate science that was really very mediocre, if not absurd.
Schaefer's scientific pride faced an even bigger challenge. Himmler's quasi-historical account of Atlantis, backed by the Ahnenerbe's pseudo-science, was to him a fantasy without foundation. As a scientist, he didn't believe a word of it. Schaefer thought that he could ride the Nazi tiger, and that this expedition would ensure a glittering scientific career.
I think he was quite ambitious in many ways, but also very much willing to manipulate people, willing to manipulate institutions so that he would get what he wanted.
Desperate to return to Tibet, Schaefer couldn't resist Himmler's offer. So Schaefer made a devil's pact with Himmler. To realize his ambition, he agreed to an impossible task. And ultimately, he would pay a heavy price. Ernst Schaefer was a political animal, always able to manipulate a situation to his advantage. Or so he thought. In 1933, Schaefer had been studying for his doctorate when Hitler was elected Reichschancellor of Germany and the Nazis swept to power. The Nazis' racial policies caused many Jews to leave the country, as did many scientific researchers. But Schaefer embraced the new order and signed up to Himmler's increasingly powerful SS. In Nazi Germany, that's how ambitious young scientists got ahead.
It was actually very sensible of Schaefer to join the SS in 1933. He was ambitious. He had unusual ambitions. He didn't just want a university seat. He wanted support for his work as a naturalist. He rightly believed that the SS would back him.
He himself said that politics serves science and science serves politics. If he could make that illusion himself, then it would justify and explain why he was so willing, so ready to join a political movement, because it gave him the scientific freedom to pursue the researches that he believed was his mission.
But Schaefer found the realities of mixing politics and science impossible from the start. Schaefer's meticulous scientific methods would never chime with Himmler's bizarre cut-and-paste theories. So while Schaefer benefited from official SS support, he also suffered from official SS interference. The Ahnenerbe plied him with its preferred candidates to join the SS expedition to Tibet. Corrupt archaeologists, self-styled mystics, and pseudo-scientists.
Now, the Ahnenerbe is very curious because there are some genuine scientists working for it. They're probably rather embarrassed. But there are some cranks as well. You have a fellow called Willigut, or Weisthor, who is literally insane. And yet, Himmler regards him as a kind of guru, as a wise man. People like Schaefer, they're appalled when they stumble on people like Willigut. You can imagine their reaction, what am I doing here with people like this?
Pseudo-science was anathema to the rigorous and ambitious Schaefer. Risking Himmler's wrath, Schaefer rejected the Ahnenerbe's candidates.
Schaefer was able to resist some of the more overt pressure that Himmler was putting on him. Schaefer also was able to keep his distance from the Ahnenerbe, the ancestral heritage, as such, and be semi-independent, really, of all of it.
Schaefer's vision was very different and very clear. He wanted to conduct an objective scientific survey of Tibet, a comprehensive study of its terrain and wildlife, of its people and their customs. It was a holistic approach to science ahead of its time. The great naturalist Charles Darwin had the Galapagos Islands. Ernst Schaefer would have Tibet.
Schaefer and a number of other European naturalists believed that the Himalayas were a kind of source point for many different species, if not all species in the world. So to go to the Himalayas, which is where Tibet is, was a means of going back to the source, of understanding how species developed and spread across the world.
There was a theory that Tibet was essentially like a sort of waterfall of species, and that there was something interesting happening there genetically.
Schaefer wrote a manifesto describing the kind of men he wanted to take with him.
An ideologically homogeneous, healthy team, comradeship according to soldierly principles, in which each member possesses, in addition to his sound knowledge of his subject, of which he is a master, also as much versatility as possible.
Schaefer wanted true scientists, but he was still playing a political game. Himmler wanted each scientist to have one vital qualification: membership of the SS.
There were plenty of academics in this period who were not members of the SS. So I think Schaefer took a lot of SS members partly because that brought prestige, partly that made sure that Himmler would not necessarily withdraw his patronage.
To achieve his vision of pure scientific research, Schaefer himself would go as zoologist, ornithologist, botanist, and of course team leader. As team geologist, he chose 24-year-old Karl Wienert, and as entomologist, 38-year-old Ernst Krause.
There was one member of the expedition was interested in Tibetan insects, butterflies and so on. Another member of the expedition was meticulously taking geomagnetic readings at different points across the Himalayas. I don't think you can really say there is a Nazi kind of butterfly collector, or that there is anything political about geomagnetism.
But Schaefer couldn't ignore Himmler's quest to find evidence of an ancient Nordic invasion of Tibet. So he did accept one Ahnenerbe candidate onto his team, 26-year-old anthropologist Bruno Beger.
When you come to Bruno Beger, the expedition anthropologist, I think you are looking at a political scientific research project, which is to investigate the connections between the peoples of the Himalayas and Europeans.
Deciphering a person's racial heritage was Beger's speciality. He'd been trained to do this by measuring people. Skull shape and facial features were thought by racial anthropologists to be particularly important. They separated what they saw as the superior Aryan race from the inferior races.
Bruno Beger had done some research on racial theories and racial mixing in particular. He had worked with Heinrich Himmler, who was a very famous big shot amongst racial scientists in the Third Reich.
Schaefer realized racial anthropology was essential to the success of his expedition. He needed Beger. He was the only person who might find the evidence Himmler had asked him to provide.
Beger and Schaefer at this point both really believe in a lot of the ideas that are around in National Socialist Germany. They do primarily see themselves as scientists in their future careers, really. The problem with that, however, of course, is that science and politics are very, very closely linked in Nazi Germany. You can't have science without the politics.
Himmler believed they would produce enough evidence to justify the expedition itself, and it would add to his dream of recreating a German culture linked very directly to the Aryan past.
Schaefer had his team in place. After a year of preparation, he was ready to lead his expedition into Tibet. But his timing couldn't have been worse. By the spring of 1938, Europe was in political turmoil. The German war machine was gearing up. The Nazis had reoccupied the Rhineland taken from Germany at the end of the First World War, and now marched into German-speaking Austria, the first steps to a greater Germany. The international situation didn't stop Schaefer's expedition setting out from Berlin on April the 19th, 1938. But it could stop him getting to Tibet. War in Asia left Schaefer only one possible route to Tibet, through India. And this brought him into direct conflict with the British Empire. Tibet was a nominally independent country, ruled in the absence of the young Dalai Lama by a regent and a council of ministers. The British ensured they were the only Europeans allowed to advise the Tibetan government.
The British at this point in time weren't really that keen on allowing Schaefer into Tibet. However, that wasn't necessarily completely uncharacteristic. The British had never been particularly keen on allowing foreign expeditions into Tibet. The Tibetan government itself was also never particularly keen on allowing anyone other than the British into Tibet.
Schaefer nevertheless sailed via the Suez Canal for India. In this sensitive situation, he played down the SS support for his expedition to avoid antagonizing the British. But a Nazi newspaper ran a glowing article celebrating the expedition's glorious SS connections. Before Schaefer even arrived, British and Indian newspapers burst into print, with headlines screaming, "Gestapo agent in India." They were accused of being German spies. It was a disaster for Schaefer. The British authorities didn't give the German expedition permission even to enter India. The precious expedition Schaefer had prepared for all his life was over before it had even started. Again, Himmler's personal support was crucial. He wrote a bitter letter of complaint to Britain, read by the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain.
You know yourself that up to now my attitude towards every Englishman who has come to Germany has been entirely friendly. For that reason, I am the more astonished that the English should treat one of my men in a brusque, wounding and unfriendly way. I cannot imagine the authorities are so stupid as to see in the scientist Dr. Schaefer, officially dispatched by me, a spy.
Despite the gathering pace of Nazi Germany's war machine, Britain was still trying to appease Hitler. So after Himmler's intervention, the British backed down.
Appeasement is the big word of the time, that Britain has accepted that avoidance of war is the prime consideration, and therefore wants amicable relations as far as they can be achieved with Germany.
The British eventually gave Schaefer permission to go into northern India, to explore the remote province of Sikkim. but he was expressly forbidden to enter Tibet without official leave. Schaefer was not a man to take no for an answer, but he had to take what he could get, for the time being. Once in Sikkim, Schaefer expanded his operation, hiring porters and pack horses, buying food and equipment. Despite being forbidden to enter Tibet, Schaefer also hired Tibetan speakers. As close as possible to the Tibet border, Schaefer set his team to work on their varied scientific research, collecting data for his scientific survey and also for Himmler's quest for European traits he believed would racially link the German people to the Atlantean super race. Sikkim became a place of great interest to Bega.
There are many people in northern India who are descended from Tibetans, so Bega had a lot to start with.
For an anthropologist and ethnologist like Bega, the races of this remote area were fascinating. As Schaefer noted,
nearly all these fragment tribes have preserved their own cultures and their own languages and are distinguished by well-marked racial characteristics.
Bega made meticulous measurements, compared eye color to a chart, and compared hair color to graded samples. No detail was too small or obscure for his specialist equipment to measure.
He'd brought a vast array of scientific instruments, which could all be ordered from scientific mail catalogues in the Third Reich, really. One particularly outlandish instrument that he brought was an instrument designed to measure the curvature of fingernails, for instance.
Racial anthropologists measured racial identity and status in the shape of the skeleton, and in particular, the skull. The cephalic index was the ratio between the breadth and depth of the head. A long, narrow Teutonic head indicated North European ancestry.
He would measure the ratio between your forehead and your nose, the distance between your eyebrows, and all sorts of very intricate measurements. And although it seems rather crude now, he is in a way measuring your genetic inheritance.
If they could prove by physical measurement of the head and the face and so on, that indeed the Tibetans were a direct link physically with modern Germans, then the link between the Supermen notion settled in the Shangri-La of Tibet and modern Germany would be made.
Bega's expert measurements of the short, dark-skinned, black-haired peoples of Sikkim would struggle to find evidence for Himmler's fantasy of the superhuman, blonde, blue-eyed conquerors of Tibet. Himmler wanted evidence of a dominant strain of people. In his mind, these would naturally form the upper class, the Tibetan ruling elite.
He's particularly interested in Tibetan aristocrats in Lhasa, and he wants to find a connection between the Tibetan elite and Nordic people.
But the British had condemned Schaefer to fester in Sikkim. As weeks turned into months, he realized his expedition was doomed to fail if they couldn't get over the Tibetan border. He wrote in his diary,
"We are at Tibet's frontier. It is the realm of our most powerful yearning. Up there, not far away at all, is the border pass."
The border haunted Schaefer's imagination. There was nothing physically to stop him.
There are neither guards nor sentinels, neither barrier nor gates. At that lonely altitude, there is only an oboe, a heap of stones wrapped in prayer flags.
Schaefer, in desperation, was even considering sneaking over the border. If he did, he risked more damaging anti-Nazi headlines and an international incident. But if he didn't, he'd face Himmler's fury.
No one on the expedition wants to go back to Germany, having not got to Tibet. So for Schaefer, this is a crisis moment.
He'd put up a massive expedition, put a lot of personal effort and investment into all of this.
Somehow he has to cross the Himalayas. Otherwise he's going to lose face in Germany. He doesn't want to be humiliated.
Schaefer was torn. He felt honor bound to resist the temptation.
I have promised the Viceroy not to cross the Tibetan border without official leave. And as a German, I'm not willing to break a promise. But what does official leave mean?
Schaefer was looking for a way to wriggle out of his promise to the British. And he was in luck. One day, Bega noticed a rather well-dressed Tibetan riding past the camp. He recorded the event in his diary.
Suddenly, a Tibetan appeared. My next thought is to measure him. Then our native translator whispers to us that this is a high official.
Here was an important advisor to a man of influence, Tering Raja, a Tibetan prince who ruled the province just over the forbidden border. Schaefer seized the opportunity to ingratiate himself with the Tibetan ruling class. The charm offensive might be his first step on the road to Lhasa. The team got off to a good start, observing Tibetan protocols as they served tea. Schaefer, they made out, was a great and powerful leader. Schaefer, in his turn, spoke of his love of Tibet and how he yearned to see Lhasa, and they showered their honored guest with gifts. Schaefer gave him a begging letter in Tibetan to take to his master, Tering Raja. He hoped the prince might intercede with the ruling council to let him enter Tibet. It was a slim hope, and all Schaefer could do was wait. As the summer of 1938 slipped into autumn, Schaefer remained isolated on the India-Tibet border. It seemed that the British had won. He was trapped. Then, after 5 months of waiting, a letter from Lhasa.
To the German Herr Dr. Schaefer, Master of 100 Sciences.
First, the ruling council declared that Tibet is forever prohibited to foreigners. But then the letter took on a more friendly tone.
It nevertheless appears from your letter that you intend only friendship and to see the Holy Land and its religious institutions.
Then at last the translator read the news they thought would never come.
We grant you permission to enter Lhasa and stay there for 14 days.
The elation was indescribable. All 5 German scientists were invited by the Tibetan ruling council to visit Lhasa for 2 weeks. Schaefer had wriggled out of his promise to the British. Here was the longed-for official leave.
It was pretty spectacular getting these German scientists into Lhasa.
Getting into Lhasa was a big propaganda coup, really, for Nazi Germany. Particularly so since the Nazis did, at this point in time, make a lot out of the fact that Germans could supposedly deal with non-European peoples better than the British.
With news of the historic invitation, Himmler promoted the whole team. Schaefer to the rank of Hauptsturmführer, a captain, in the SS. On January the 19th, 1939, Schaefer saw the Dalai Lama's vast Potala Palace towering over Lhasa. It was an historic occasion. They were the first Germans ever to enter the holy city. The Tibetan government had officially invited Schaefer, so he expected a grand welcome. But just a single official greeted them. A British representative in Lhasa had intervened and changed the ruling council's minds. Schaefer's great coup would soon turn to abject failure if the nobles of Lhasa ignored his expedition. Now Schaefer the politician got to work. Showing due deference, he lavished the finest gifts on the ministers and nobility of Lhasa.
What Schaefer did in Lhasa, there was definitely a fair bit of politics. Schaefer was trying to build up friendly relations with the Tibetan government. Up until that point in time, the Tibetan government had only really dealt with the British government.
Schaefer paid particular attention to the regent, Rating Rinpoche, the ruler of Tibet. Schaefer found he had a unique advantage over the British in getting close to the Tibetans. Germany and Tibet, he told them, shared a common bond: the swastika. For centuries, Tibetans had regarded the ancient symbol as a sign of good fortune and permanence. Schaefer made gifts of Nazi emblems, explaining to his hosts how revered the symbol was in Germany. The Tibetans were delighted, not knowing that in Europe at that very moment, the swastika was a symbol of oppression and violence. With this deception, Schaefer scored another great political coup.
The regent later on sent a letter back home to Hitler, addressing him as the German king, and asked for more contact between Germany and Tibet and friendly relations.
To His Majesty Adolf Hitler, I have pleasure to let Your Majesty know that Dr. Schaefer and his party, who are the first Germans to visit Tibet, have been allowed without any objection, and every necessary assistance is rendered on their arrival.
Thanks to Schaefer's access, the ruling council gave the Germans unprecedented freedom to film Lhasa, its monasteries and medieval setting. Schaefer and his team documented the exotic streets and markets with their rich variety of food and cloth and jewelry. But Schaefer's personal research was suffering. The wonderful letter from Lhasa had also imposed a terrible condition that struck at the heart of why Schaefer was in Tibet at all: hunting. It was a bitter blow. Schaefer had traveled halfway round the world only to be banned from collecting wildlife for his own research. Well, not quite. Schaefer did manage to hunt, but quietly, mainly with a catapult and only the occasional bullet, when no one was about.
Schaefer, of course, did really circumvent some of the conditions, although not in a very ostentatious manner.
Beger's work also suffered a severe setback. During the colourful New Year festival, as Schaefer and the team filmed the magnificent dances and parades, they got too close with their cameras and were stoned and injured by angry monks. After that, Beger's work measuring people was considered by the team to be provocative and foolhardy. A frustrated Beger saw an extraordinary variety of people slip through his fingers. Shaven-headed monks in dark red robes, burly yak herders dressed in heavy sheepskin, delicate officials in shimmering chubas, and what he described as many beautiful and tall people with even features. He couldn't gather any hard physiological data, that might fulfill Himmler's quest. Yet while the science expedition was stalled, the Germans remained great friends of the regent. He extended the expedition's stay from 2 weeks to 2 months. Schaefer had sidelined the British, much to their annoyance.
Well, the British were worried partly that Schaefer would be able to stoke up anti-British sentiment in Tibet. In fact, this becomes more and more of an issue throughout 1939 as appeasement in Europe started to fail.
In September 1938, in a spirit of appeasement, the British had brokered the Munich Agreement and let Nazi Germany occupy the largely German-speaking Sudetenland, then part of Czechoslovakia. But 2 months later came Kristallnacht, one night of violence by brown shirts and civilians that left 91 Jews dead and 30,000 in concentration camps. The true nature of Nazism had been revealed. The time for appeasement was over. The Germans still enjoyed official approval. His team were allowed to leave Lhasa to explore the holiest places in Tibet, banned even to the British. But as they explored the sacred Yarlung Valley east of Lhasa, they began to receive messages urging them to return home to Germany.
Schaefer was keen to stay and explore areas that hadn't been explored by many other people, just to make his expedition special, just to really enable him to use what he was doing to obtain fame, really, back in Germany.
A European war seemed increasingly likely, even inevitable. If they waited much longer, they risked being interned by the British as enemy aliens. The expedition was running out of time. By March 1939, Nazi Germany had expanded east again to occupy Bohemia and Moravia. But Britain had a mutual assistance pact with Poland, and any further German advance into Poland could not be so easily ignored. Europe was on the brink of war. Even the ebullient Schaefer was becoming increasingly anxious about British intentions and began to fear arrest and detention in India. Bager reported that in the summer of 1939, Schaefer received a letter from his father and was so deeply affected by it that he disappeared for an hour.
His father pointed out there's a war coming, and he said to the son, if I were you, I would make the best of what you've had and return.
If Schaefer wanted a chance of actually getting all his samples and specimens and data back to Germany and make something out of them and make a name for himself, he really needed to leave before war broke out.
Bager wrote that he and the others were also being warned they were in danger.
We sat around the fireplace and discussed it. Suddenly we realized a letter and transmission from Berlin had the same message. My wife had been hinting too.
The war, they were told, would start after the summer. That was only weeks away. It was time to go home to Germany. Despite the rising political tension and Schaefer's fears of capture and detention, the team were allowed safe passage through India by the British. The 5 SS officers were even able to fly out of Calcutta with British Indian Airways. But what would Himmler have to say about Schaefer's lack of evidence for his quest for the people of Atlantis? And what might he do? Even worse, when the team touched down in Munich, Heinrich Himmler himself would be there waiting. Now would come the reckoning. But Himmler welcomed Schaefer and his team as heroes.
Here were fine young men, great scientists, you could call them, or young Germans at their best. It showed them opening up the world, or restoring the evidence, looking for the evidence, being adventurous, giving Germany that sense of encompassing some of the best virtues and values of a modern civilization linked to the Aryan past. That they didn't make the link in physical hard terms, in a sense, didn't matter. The expedition in itself was its own justification.
Himmler was elated by Schaefer's achievements. In Tibet, he had trounced the British and proven German dominance in the region.
The propaganda value of the expedition was definitely greater than the scientific value of the expedition. Himmler certainly was delighted by the outcome, shaking the expedition members' hands at the airport.
Just 27 days later, Nazi Germany, fatally committed to its policy of territorial and racial domination, invaded Poland. The Second World War began. Schaefer was not yet 30 when he returned to Germany a national hero. But what had his extraordinary expedition to Tibet actually achieved? Schaefer's personal scientific vision came to nothing. Most of the huge amount of data his hand-picked team of scientists gathered lay unexamined and then lost in the tumult of war. What of the proof of the super race of Atlantis? It seems Himmler had asked the wrong guys. He'd certainly asked the wrong question. Even racial anthropologist Bruno Beger had found the Atlantis Nordic idea hard to swallow.
Beger was trying to find out what kind of racial mixture there was in Tibet. I don't think Beger's research was as grand as believing the Nordic race had changed all of Asian history.
Bruno Beger said that when they were gathered round the campfire in northern India or Tibet, they would reminisce about some of Himmler's stranger views and laugh about them.
But these men, as SS scientists, were supporting Nazi ideology, working with a man whose crimes were beyond imagining.
Heinrich Himmler, let's not forget he was a super efficient bureaucrat who created a state within a state that carried out the worst genocide in human history. So we shouldn't reduce him to an eccentric or a crank.
Himmler, to avoid trial for his crimes and death by hanging, committed suicide after the war. In February 1943, Beger was sent to Auschwitz to make facial masks of prisoners. Soon afterwards, 109 Jews he had worked on were gassed for an infamous Nazi project, the Jewish Skull Collection. In 1971, Beger was tried and convicted as an accomplice to murder. He received a 3-year suspended sentence. After the war, Schaefer's glittering career evaporated. He took a job creating a wildlife park in Venezuela, one of the sanctuaries for Nazis in South America. Schaefer's life was cursed by his membership of the SS and close association with the evil Heinrich Himmler.